This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello everyone, welcome to Living History, and I hope you've enjoyed the recent series of special podcasts we did live from battlefields around the world. If you haven't listened to them, go and check them out because we had an amazing experience over Anzac Day, walking the ground at Gallipoli and then carrying on to Vietnam and walking along Tarn battlefield. So some great episodes there. It's a real privilege to always walk these historic sites in the footsteps of the Anzacs. So if you haven't listened to those ones, go back and check them out, our special series over Anzac Day. This week's episode, one I'm really looking forward to bringing you because it's always a wonderful privilege to speak to a veteran, but this was an incredible privilege. I got to speak to a World War II veteran fairly recently, and that's a rare thing these days. There are not many World War II veterans left. Before long, there'll be none left. So it's so important we sit down and hear these stories now. And so I was fortunate enough to speak to Bert Le-Merton, and Bert is 100 years old. You wouldn't believe it listening to him on the recording, but he's 100 years old. He's a veteran of Tobruk, Alamein, New Guinea and Borneo. So 4 of the most incredible Australian operations of the Second World War. It was just wonderful to sit down with Bert and hear his experiences during the war, his attitude to the fighting, and just what he got up to in more than 5 years of service during the Second World War. So I'm really glad to be able to bring this one to you. Sit down, grab a coffee, relax. You're really going to enjoy hearing from Bert about his experiences during the Second World War. I'm here talking to Bert Le-Merton, a World War II veteran, and I'm looking forward to chatting with him. Bert, thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for being with us and sharing your story. Let's start with your childhood. Let's start with where you grew up. We were talking about this before, that you lived in Sydney a lot, but you didn't come from Sydney. Tell me about your childhood and where you grew up.
And initially, I was brought up at the Mount Buffalo resort there for the first couple of years of my life. From there, we moved on to Melbourne, where my sister and my brother were born, and then in 1920 or thereabouts, we moved back to Sydney.
Okay, and what was it like growing up back in the 1920s? Did you have lots of brothers and sisters? Was it just you?
Oh, I just had one brother and one sister. I really don't remember much about that period of my life. I can remember a bit about Mount Buffalo. I haven't got a clue about Melbourne. It's completely outside my understanding. When we moved back to school, when we came to Sydney for the first time, in effect, we were living in City Road, Sydney. We called it City Road, Sydney. It's probably Chippendale. But we were living there in a house just down from the pub. We had one room in that house, and my dad was working, of course. My mum was also working, but she was taking my young brother with her because he was really a babe. And I would take my sister across into the park to what served as a sort of a preschool, I guess. And it was there that we spent most of our days during the course of the week. And we'd come home at about 3 o'clock and just wait for Mum to get home from work.
What did your mum and dad do for work?
Got no idea. Let's face it, I was around about 5 years old.
Okay. What about when you were older? Where were you living in your teenage years?
A bit later on, we moved to another house also in City Road, and my mum became the lessee of that house. And we lived there in 2 rooms, as it happens, and the other rooms in the house were all rented out. It was a residential building.
Okay. And what was your father's career? What did he do for his career?
He had no specific career. He just did whatever jobs were available from time to time. He worked at the showground, for example, for quite a time as a blacksmith striker, when they were building roads in the showground. So that was a long, long time ago.
Yeah, so a general handyman then. He was the definition of a handyman.
In effect, yes. And then he got into sales of planting of plants. He'd go up to Mascot, where the market gardeners were, and pick up bundles of plants, and he'd flog those door to door.
So tell us about that period. Tell us about the period of the Second World War. So how old were you in 1939? You must have been in your early 20s when the war started.
I was 21. Actually, what happened, I was one of those 21-year-olds who were called up for full-time training in the military. First into the 35th CMF battalion at Rutherford. That would be in January of 1940.
Okay.
That was for a 3-month full-time period.
What was your feeling at that time, being, a young bloke living in Sydney when the war broke out? What did you think about the fact that there was another world war so soon after the last one?
Well, essentially at that time, the intention was that we would be personnel who would be used for defence of Australia. And while I was in that camp at Rutherford, I enlisted in the AIF. But I was eventually came back to Sydney from Rutherford, fully armed, rifle, bayonet, all the regular gear that soldiers would have. And then on the 27th of May 1940, I attended the AIF section and was transferred to Ingleburn as a member of 2nd 13th Battalion.
Okay, so did you volunteer to join the regular AIF, or did they just allocate you?
Yes, no, I volunteered.
And what was your reasoning then? Why did you were you very keen to join the war effort, or was it just the next step in your military career?
Well,
what was your thinking?
I think it was simply the next step in my military career at that point.
Were you very passionate about stopping the Germans when the war had started? And
No. It was something that we needed to do.
So what about, with your friends? Was the war a big topic that everyone was talking about? Was there a feeling that everyone had to do their bit? Or was it just something that was kind of happening in the background?
No, I think it was just something that was happening in the background. There were some who felt that they needed to be there, and others who were simply going because it wasn't going to be very long, and they'd perhaps get a trip overseas.
What about this idea that we hear that everyone thought it was going to be a great adventure to go off and fight in a war? Do you think, from your experience, that's true?
Not from my point of view. I didn't look at it from that point of view. Eventually, I realised that it was going to be an important event in my life and in Australia's life.
So you were assigned to the 2nd 13th?
2nd 13th Battalion at Ingleburn.
And what job did they give you in the battalion when you joined up?
I went into the light anti-aircraft platoon at that point, which seemed a bit odd because I'd trained for 3 months as a mortarman. However, I went into the light anti-aircraft platoon armed with Lewis guns in those days, and we walked all over Ingleburn, of course, marched all over Ingleburn, and we trained with that particular type of weapon, along with the ordinary 303 rifles, etc.
Okay. How was the 303? Was that a good weapon? Did you enjoy shooting?
It was a good weapon, yeah, an excellent weapon, as a matter of fact. But I never fired one in action.
And so you so they put you on the anti-aircraft guns, the Lewis guns, which are actually a First World War weapon, aren't they? They would have been
precisely. They were a First World War weapon, and we trained with those and we became proficient in their use. And when we were on the way to the Middle East on the Queen Mary, we participated in the anti-aircraft groups on that particular ship, so that they had Lewis guns mounted in a couple of spots up on the upper decks, so that we, along with 17th Battalion, manned those guns during that period on the trip over to India.
And before you left Australia, what was the training like that you went through? Did you do a lot of training?
Normal infantry training in our case, a lot of marching, a lot of weapon training, and use of bayonets on the rifle. But it was it was boring in a sense, because I had done it all before for 3 months.
Did you feel...
But for the civvies, that was new to them. We were the old soldiers, 3 months old, and they were the new boys.
Was there a feeling amongst you and your mates in the battalion that you were well trained when you first deployed?
We considered that we were a well-trained unit, and we figured that the 2nd 13th Battalion was also a well-trained unit, especially from the sense that many of the intake of the 2nd 13th Battalion were previous full-time soldiers or CMF soldiers. A lot of them came from Rutherford, as did I, because our CO had always been a CO of one of the other infantry battalions at Rutherford at that time. So I think he was probably a bit selective in the people who he called into the 2nd 13th Battalion.
So you did your training. Did you form lots of new friendships with the other blokes in the battalion?
You do, especially with your own platoon members.
Okay.
You become mates, close mates with all of those blokes. In fact, one of those that you saw on one of that photo in there became my best mate, John Dixon.
Fantastic. And so you sailed from Australia on the Queen Mary, you said?
Yes.
So this is still in 1940, obviously?
Yeah, that was in 1940.
And you sailed for the Middle East?
I've got specific dates in various diaries and things, of course.
No, that's okay. It's so what was it like sailing away from Australia with a ship full of troops heading for the war?
It was really interesting. It was fascinating in point of fact, because this was something which be completely outside the experience of most of the people there. To travel on something like the Queen Mary, I mean, that was a big boat.
They had it refitted as a troop transport, didn't they?
Had to be refitted. Because we were specialist anti-aircraft personnel, we had 6 men to a cabin.
Okay.
Which was pretty good because there was other people down in the depths.
So you had it good.
We had a good accommodation.
Excellent. And so you travelled over. You said you were heading for India. Is that where they took you?
Yeah, we stopped off at Bombay, and we trekked up to a place called Deolali in Queensland for several days. Then we came back and boarded a little Dutch freighter, which took us up into the canal, of course, and eventually dropped us off there for transport to Palestine.
How much did they tell you about what you were going to be doing? Was it simply, get on the ship, boys, we're heading off, or did they give you an indication of where you were going, what you were going to be doing?
No, we had no idea. We knew we were headed for Palestine for a training camp, but other than that, we had no idea what was in store for us.
You arrived in the Middle East, and you ended up at Tobruk, and obviously Tobruk is very famous in Australian history. Yeah. What were your because I know your battalion as well. Your battalion was there for longer than just about anyone else. What were the experiences like during that siege of Tobruk?
It's difficult to explain. I mean, you just feel telling somebody else what it's all about is a bit of a problem because although it's in your head, you sort of can't express it in words. I can remember that we had difficulties in washing, for example. You had one bottle of water a day to serve all purposes. So a lot of people didn't shave very frequently because they drank a lot of water. And it's little things like that that come to mind, but you sort of put them out of your mind.
And how often were you coming under attack from the Germans?
Not very frequently. I mean, there were patrols out. Our personnel had patrols going out covering his lines, and no doubt he had patrols coming in looking at us too. But the actual attack periods were relatively few.
Were you involved in those patrols, going out to probe the German lines?
No, I was a mortar man, so I normally wouldn't. I went out on one patrol because the other members of the unit I was with had all been out on patrols the previous night. So I went out on one, but it was only a short patrol. We only went out about 500 yards and then went left 500 and back 1,000 and back to the centre and then come home kind of thing. So
what was that experience like? Were you glad to get back to the safety of your hole?
I was with a 16-year-old experienced rifleman. I agreed our detachment could go out as long as we had an experienced rifleman. I had a 16-year-old.
He was 16 and he still knew what he was doing. So
he didn't tell anybody else that.
Did you know what the big picture was in Tobruk? Did you know why you were there and what you were doing?
Well, we knew we were there to keep the Germans out and make it more difficult for them to progress through to Egypt and the canal. That was our basic purpose in life, remaining there, to stop the Germans and, of course, his Italian counterparts, moving on to Egypt and onto the canal and, in effect, controlling the whole of the Middle East.
And did you feel proud of the work you were doing to stop the Germans, or did you feel, why have the buggers put us in this position? What was the feeling amongst...
Oh, no, we were proud of why we were there, and we were keen to stay there until such time as the German could be moved back out of Africa.
And were the Germans launching air raids on you on the positions very often?
Continually. They would send bombers down to bomb Tobruk town and the port itself. Then they would circle round and follow the perimeter and just blast away with their machine guns at the perimeter as they went by.
I spoke to some veterans who had served in the Solomon Islands during the war, and they said that the most terrifying thing they experienced during the war was being bombed by aircraft because it was just so random. Yeah. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, yes, except that they, in our particular case in Tobruk in any event, their bombs were expended on the town and the docks. I only had one occasion when a bomber was dropped on the perimeter, and I happened to be out that day. I was running a message for the section commander. It happened to be the lieutenant. He was required to send a message across to company headquarters, and I took the message because his people had been out at night. So I took the message through, and on the way returning, we had a bombing session over Tobruk, and the bombs came back around the perimeter where I happened to be walking out in the open. So I just hit the deck, pretended I was dead. They dropped one bomb, it was a dud, and it rolled until it was about 50 yards away.
Really?
Oh yeah, but it was a dud. It happened frequently, and we called the engineers and told them about it, and they picked it up and took it off to do something else with it, of course. And the line of bullets from the machine guns, I could see that would be close, but I could see that it would not hit me. Otherwise I'd have simply rolled away. But I could see it had missed by about a metre, which it did. And after they'd gone, I got up and walked back to my post.
That was a near brush with destiny.
Well, it was a bit close. John Dixon was watching me from the post, and he told the story a lot more glamorously, shall we say. But as far as I was concerned, it was just part of the job. You lay down and you watched, but you didn't move until such time as you had to, in which case you rolled. I didn't have to roll because the gunner didn't see that I wasn't a dead soldier.
Were you losing lots of men at this stage? Were casualties high?
Say again?
Were the casualties high at this stage of the campaign?
Fairly high throughout the whole of the siege, but I really got no idea of what the casualties were in that time.
Did you lose many mates from your unit?
No, not from my particular platoon. We had odd ones injured from time to time with a shell burst or something, but we had no casualties at that time.
Now, Bert, I've heard people that were in the North Africa campaign talk about the Germans as they were quite a noble enemy, that there was a feeling of respect. Was that how you felt towards the Germans?
Yes, we regarded the German soldier as being a fair dinkum soldier who abided by the rules. That's the rules of war, of course. You've got to kill the other bloke if you can. But they seem to be more or less similar to ourselves. And after the whole war was all over, our Rats at Tobruk Association, for example, frequently visited their equivalent association, the Africa Corps Association, that is, and they came and visited us on occasion too.
Excellent.
So
excellent.
It wasn't. We were enemies, but we were ready to be friends, as it were.
And did you actually see much of the Germans? Did you see German prisoners coming in? I mean, I know that you weren't involved in the platoons.
From time to time, prisoners would come in. In our instance, more particularly when the outbreak eventually occurred, and the 8th Army was on its way up from Egypt. We participated in that outbreak, in point of fact.
Well, tell me about that, because your battalion was in Tobruk for longer than any other one.
Yeah,
so when did you leave Tobruk?
We were with the Polish Carpathian Brigade until their 3rd Battalion arrived. Then late in November, we moved out back into the Blue Line, doing various tasks, sometimes looking after prisoners, or pretty much that. Then when the 8th Army made us break out from Egypt and started to move on, these British divisions broke out from Tobruk, and that was at a place called Edjuda. On the 20th of November 1941, we were called out to Edjuda. That was an escarpment about 8 miles out of Tobruk. out of the normal perimeter, where the Essex Regiment had been in trouble. The Germans had driven them off their position and taken quite a number of prisoners. We went out and we eventually regained that position, and then they let us come back into Tobruk.
What about
That was in December, of course.
Yeah. What about into 1942? What actions did you take part in 42 in North Africa?
In North, that was the Alamein period. I was in the Alamein box for several months. In June 42, the battalion moved back into Egypt, and we were in the Alamein box. And that's where we remained, and that's where I remained until I was pulled out about 3 weeks before the final outbreak by 9-Div and the Brits. I was back in Palestine by then. I happened to be a mortar instructor, a qualified mortar instructor, and I was sent back about 3 weeks before the 23rd of October. That's when the outbreak commenced. I was out about about 3 weeks, I'd think, in Palestine, training reinforcements.
Okay.
So up between June and that time, I was in the Alamein box. But the actual Alamein breakout, no, I wasn't there. I was back in Palestine training Rios.
What's your memories of that time at Alamein in the box? What do you recall about that period?
From our point of view, it wasn't all that difficult. We were in red line positions, of course. There was an attack on the infantry section ahead of us, but it broke off and prisoners came back. We didn't engage. The infantry dealt with that. That was the only actual situation in which we sighted German enemy there. I had a detachment involved in support of Bulimba, which was an attack by the 15th Battalion, the Queensland Battalion. I had a support role in that, along with another detachment from the 13th Battalion and a detachment from the 17th Battalion. We were all posted back about 4,000 yards, and we engaged from that position until the 15th Battalion made their final attack on that occasion. It was unsuccessful, of course, but that's the way it goes.
When you look back on those two big actions in the North Africa campaign, the siege of Tobruk, which was, about hanging on under those terrible conditions, but then the great success of the Battle of Alamein, how do you look back on them now? Do you, as someone who participated in both, are you more proud of one or the other? Do you think one was more important than the other? How do you look back on them?
I think that the question of importance relies on the fact that the siege of Tobruk prevented the Germans making that access to Egypt. Now, when they did finally make that access to Egypt, we had sufficient strength to hold them without enabling them to move right in and take Egypt and the canal. And of course, the final breakout on the 23rd of October, that was the end of the Germans in effect, although they battled all the way back. The Yanks eventually came in.
Eventually?
Yeah.
Are you proud of being a rat of Tobruk?
I'm proud of being a rat of Tobruk. I'm proud of the fact that we managed to hold them out of there, in our case at any rate, for over 8 months, because our battalion didn't leave there until the 16th of December. and we went by road, and we didn't get a boat trip out to Alex. Yeah, we went by road. We were supposed to take 1,000 prisoners back, but we didn't. We escaped that task and just got on our way. But no, we were proud of that, and I was personally proud of the Ninth Div's actions in that our final outbreak from Alamein and the trip from there on. Well, nine Div bailed out after that main outbreak because they simply lost so many men, and the other divisions could carry on without them anyway.
Did you realise at the time or soon after how significant Tobruk would become to Australia?
At the time, not at that particular time, but later on we realised, as we read the histories, we realised how important it was to retain that place for the time we did.
I certainly agree with that. And so your North Africa moves on, and you're now training mortar men. Was that in Egypt you were training mortar men, or back in Palestine?
I became a mortar man in Palestine, and I was a mortar man at Alamein.
Okay.
Until such time as I was sent out to be a trainer.
Okay, where was the training taking place when they sent you out to train? Where was that?
That was the Middle East Weapon Training School in Palestine.
In Palestine, okay. And so was that the final chapter for you of the North Africa campaign?
Pretty much, yes, that's quite right, because our battalion was rebuilt there with Rios that I'd trained, among other things. We lost quite a few men at Alamein. About, I think there were 6 from our platoon, including the platoon sergeant, in point of fact.
What was the state of the men who'd been through Tobruk and then Alamein? Obviously, they'd been through a hell of a period.
Yeah.
How was the unit by that stage when it was all over in North Africa?
By the time it was all over and it was rebuilt with the Rios, and some of those reinforcements had gone into Egypt before the battalion was removed, before the whole division was removed, in fact, although they didn't see any action, but they had joined the battalion so that they were aware of what the battalion and the other battalions in the division had done. And I think they were proud of being there. And, of course, we were proud to rejoin them when they got back into Palestine.
Do you remember when and how word came through that the division would be moved to the Pacific to take on the Japanese?
No, I don't know when that. I know when I can tell when we boarded the boats to come home.
Do you remember about that time though? Do you remember the mood that? Because it's a very big move for a division. You've been trained to fight that war, and now we're moving you to the whole other side of the world to fight another enemy.
That's right.
What was the feeling amongst the men in your unit?
Well, we were anxious to get home. We knew that Egypt was safe. The Middle East was safe, in point of fact, because not only were the Brits there, but the Yanks were there. And so we were anxious to get home and tackle this, to our minds, new enemy, although we'd known, of course, that it was happening. So we were anxious to get home, not only just to have a bit of leave with our folks at home, but to tackle the Japanese.
How long did they give you back in Australia after you left the Middle East?
I don't remember. I can work it out.
It was a bit of time, though, wasn't it? It wasn't just a few days. You had a bit of time
because we had to retrain. We were all in desert clobber, for example. The khaki shirts and shorts and things like that. We had to be retrained. We had to be re-equipped with green gear.
And where did that training take place? Were you trained back in Sydney?
That was back in Queensland.
Oh, in Queensland, okay.
Because Queensland was closer to the jungle country than anywhere in New South Wales. So that training was at Ravenshoe in Queensland.
And how did you find that as an experienced group of fighting men? How did you find that transition? Did the stuff they were telling you about jungle warfare make sense? Did you feel that you already had enough experience? What was the feeling of this entirely new way of training?
We felt we needed the training because the territory would be entirely different, but we were convinced that we could handle it anyway.
I understand, and I think with what came next, you were right as well. So they retrained you, and then New Guinea. That was the next.
Then New Guinea was the next move. Yes.
Do you remember when it was that you got up to New Guinea?
That was on the 16th of July, 1943. We set sail from Aussie for New Guinea, and we reached Milne Bay on the 10th of July 43. On the 2nd of September, we boarded LSIs, landing ships infantry, and on the 4th of September 1943, we landed at Yellow Beach on the right flank of the main division. We were flanking troops again, covering the flank in case the Japanese came in to attack.
They always had you on the flank, Bert. They always had you in the exposed position on the flank. They must have known you were good.
We could hold the juries off. We could hold the Japs off.
So which battle was that where you were on the right flank?
Lae.
At Lae, okay.
That was the landing at Lae.
So that was your first experience of combat in the Pacific?
That was our first combat, yeah, exactly. We, as I say, we landed there at Yellow Beach, and then we boarded LSIs on the 27th of July, and on the 22nd of September we did another seaborne landing at Finchhaven.
Okay. And that was some pretty tough fighting through that part of the campaign. What were your recollections?
For us it wasn't, because there was very little resistance from our point of view. The enemy didn't resist tremendously.
Okay. What was your feeling about this new enemy, the Japanese? Was it you had said before that you thought the Germans were quite a noble enemy? Did you have the same feeling about the Japanese?
No, we didn't. We had heard of the treatments they afforded the 8th Division, and we knew that we were up against a entirely different foe who had a different approach to fighting. We figured that we wouldn't be captured alive because we'd be dead anyway.
What was the attitude of the other Australians? Did you serve alongside units that had been fighting at Kokoda while you'd been in North Africa?
No,
or were you separate?
No.
Okay. Was there a feeling of common purpose between the guys that had been fighting in the Pacific and the guys that had been fighting in North Africa? What was the feeling between, across the RAF about the different work that had been going on?
I think there was a realisation that we were fighting a common enemy, and it just happened that we had experience in another sphere which perhaps they hadn't. The 6th Division were in New Guinea. Now, they had made the initial advances in Egypt and through Libya, and in fact they were the ones who had actually taken Tobruk in the first place, and we relieved them so they could go to Greece.
And that didn't go well for them.
That didn't go well with them, but it's just one of those things. They had experience in New Guinea, but we weren't in contact with them because they were inland, we were seaborne.
I spoke recently to a Kokoda veteran who was in a militia unit, and his story was pretty typical of the militia blokes that sort of ended up there and found themselves in the middle of the Kokoda campaign. And they always spoke about units like yours, the 2nd OAF, that when they arrived, he spoke about they were older than us. These were soldiers that had been fighting in the desert at Tobruk and Alamein. He said we looked up to them like they were the most remarkable soldiers. Is that what the feeling was like?
That's exactly what the feeling would be, exactly. Yeah. And the recruits that came to us had similar feelings with respect to us.
It's interesting because of the outstanding work that the militia units did against the Japanese in Kokoda.
Exactly. The next time I struck up with the 35th Battalion, which was the one, the 35th Battalion CMF I'd been at Rutherford with, the next time I came up against them was New Guinea.
Okay. And they'd been through a lot by then.
We relieved them on the trip up the coast.
Okay. And they'd been through a lot, hadn't they, in 42
exactly.
by that time. How do you feel about the remarks that were made early against them, the Choco soldiers, and what did you think about that?
They were, well, let's face it, I was a Choco soldier in a sense for 3 months. No, we didn't have that regard. We thought of them as blokes who were serving in a battalion which had been formed to protect Australia, and it was in New Guinea protecting Australia.
Yeah, they got the raw end of the deal with that.
They got the raw end of the stick. There's no question about it.
They absolutely did.
But as far as referring them to be anything else but decent soldiers would be ridiculous.
Well said. So after Ley and Finchhaven, what was next for you?
After Ley and Finchhaven, we came back home and had a bit more leave and went to the pictures occasionally. And then we were back in Queensland retraining for Borneo. We thought, in fact, that we might be going to one of the American islands that had been lost, but I don't think the Yanks wanted that.
Well, that's very true. The Americans were obviously trying to run their own show in the Pacific.
So we finished up attacking Borneo. So we did a seaborne landing at Brookton. Our battalion was in reserve there. Then we did another seaborne landing at Miri, and we were the lead battalion there. In fact, we were the only battalion there. That was at the foot of the foothills, these oil fields at Miri.
And what do you remember about the Borneo campaign?
From our point of view, it was an easy campaign in the sense that the resistance was fairly light. But there was a hell of a lot of walking through the jungle to do.
I can imagine.
We landed at the foot of an airport. There was nothing. There was a couple of wrecked planes on the airport, but there was nothing there to oppose us.
How many times during this fighting, Bert, in the Pacific, in both New Guinea and Ley, how often did you personally come up against the Japanese in combat?
Personally, not ever. Okay. Not ever. I was on one occasion on the Ream Road. I was part of a platoon group, which was a platoon patrol, which was going along the Ream Road, and we ran into trouble on that one, but we overcame it as well. We lost one man, but we managed to get out of it after a time and return.
Was that a Japanese ambush that you came into?
Yeah, that was an ambush at one of the river crossings. Les Pepper was a sergeant in the Vickers gunner platoon. He was killed there. But other than that, as I say, we expended a lot of mortar rounds, of course. I only had 2 men, one of the old blokes and one of the young blokes. And I went off down the track running a wire out after me so that I could telephone constructions. But I got to within about 50 yards of the actual point where the road entered the jungle, and stayed there waiting for whatever might happen. Nothing happened, as a matter of fact, so I eventually came back. And then later in the afternoon, the whole platoon came back.
So you fought at Borneo with your unit. Was that the last action for your unit of the war?
That was the last action I was involved in. Apart from that, that was late in it into the peace, and then the end of the war came into view.
Tell me about that. How was the feeling? Was there a feeling? I'm sorry if these seem like obvious questions, but for someone who didn't live through it, it's always fascinated me. Was there a feeling as you went on that the end must be near? We must be getting near the end. Was that a feeling, or did it all end in a rush?
Yeah, that's right. You get that feeling, and you get the knowledge passed on to you that the bombers are bombing Japan. Well, now you figure if they're going to bomb Japan, Japan's going to pack it in. Okay,
and you obviously had the news that the Germans had surrendered in May 45.
Yeah, exactly. We'd heard that, of course, and said, well, good, that bit's over. This one can't be much longer.
So you'd been at the end of the war, you'd been serving for 5 years by this stage.
Yeah.
I mean, I know this seems like a silly question, but what was that feeling when the war came to a close?
You know, at the end when it came, there was the talk of the occupation of Japan, and the occupation units were being formed, and you thought, should I hang on or should I get out now? And I decided I should get out now. But I was one of our battalion was withdrawn from the order of battle, of course, and I was one of the very late 5-yearers who returned to Australia. Some of the younger blokes stayed in and joined the occupation forces.
What do you remember, Bert, as in all of these great battles that you served in, famous battles, Tobruk, Alamein, New Guinea, Borneo, what was the worst period of the war for you in that whole process?
The worst? I think the Ream Road patrol probably was the one that affected us most, because we were working in territory that we were familiar with from training, but which was totally different to what we had been dealing with in the Middle East. And it was a bit tricky in the sense that you didn't know what was in front of you. We knew that they were enemy because it was pointed out to me, the smoke from their cooking camps. So that was the first place I engaged. And then we were fired on from the rear by mortars, and we, at that time, we'd already packed up and we were preparing to leave. So they fired on us from the rear, so we simply pulled the mortar off the jeep and loaded it up into the middle of the road and engaged from a point which was on our right behind us when we're looking back to where we were going headed for home, and we engaged that. Then we engaged on the left, which is also engaging us from behind, so that at that particular point somebody sighted one of our rounds dropping directly onto their mortar, so we considered that a kill because they didn't fire again anyway. Those were tricky situations because we were unprotected in a sense, up in the middle of the road, firing a mortar and being engaged from what was initially our rear, and fortunately the bombs from that mortar were dropping down the side of the hill, so they were below the level at which we were. But, that one was the most frightening from a point of view of closeness to the extinction.
That certainly makes sense. It sounds very hairy indeed. What's your feeling now, all these years later, looking back on your former enemies, the Germans and the Japanese? How after all these years, how do you feel now when you look back on those former enemies?
I'm proud that we were able to handle the situations we were in and redeem the positions that the enemy had set us. I suppose, well, there are a few of us left, I guess, to converse with, but we're convinced that we did the right thing at that time in joining the services, and that we achieved more than we initially hoped we would achieve.
You mentioned that the Rats of Tobruk Association met with your German counterparts from the Africa Corps?
Yes.
What was that experience like?
That went very well. We had some of our blokes who went over to their annual meetings kind of thing, and they did the same with our people, or their people came to our people. I didn't attend any of those meetings, as it happens. I wasn't one of the executives, so I was just one of the mob.
Was there any ever suggestion that you would ever do that with the Japanese, or was that just something that would happen with the Germans?
I think that was something that was never going to happen. Never going to happen. I saw a situation in our landing at New Guinea. There was a sniper, and somebody had shot him out of a tree, and somebody stabbed him. The guy who stabbed him had lost a brother in Malaysia from the Japanese, so that was just one of the situations that arise.
What's your feeling about the Japanese today, after all this time?
I think in terms of their military, at that time, their military were not very nice people. I don't know about their civilians, because until the end of the war, I never contacted a Japanese civilian. But from our point of view now, they seem to be good mates.
What do you think? Do you think we've learnt anything from this experience of the Second World War? Do you think the world is a better place because we did this? What's your impression of the big picture?
I think the world is a better place because we did it, but we're not ever going to be without war. There's always going to be somebody who wants to take control of everybody else. And I'm not saying anything beyond that.
Fair enough. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Bert? That's been excellent. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about that we haven't covered?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
No,
well, it's been really wonderful. Thank you very much for taking the time. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you.